And now, finally, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, me, to the stage. So we're going to take a look at the adoption of metaphor in comic book art, specifically the metaphor of close-up eye asymmetry. Now, usually I do my thank yous at the end. This time, though, I really feel compelled I got to do it at the beginning just to give you a little bit of context. So my talk is going to involve David Bowie. David Bowie was a kind of personal hero to me. Died on January 10th, 2016. And as a result of that, the Comics Grid, peer-reviewed scholarship of comics, put out a special call for papers on David Bowie and comic book research. So literally two of my favorite things in the world. However, at that time, I was kind of knee-deep, not only in my tenure clock, but also I was struggling with depression. It took its toll, not very productive in my first few years. It got better, but at the time, I really had to make decisions about the research that I engaged in. And this research was high risk. So completely new to me. Was I going to find anything? Even if I did find something, was it going to be, accepted? Were people going to be impressed? So whenever I have a tough decision like this and I don't know what to do, ask my wife Raquel. And she looked me in the eye and she goes, "Igor, you have to do this." So I just want to thank her. This presentation would not exist without Raquel. All right, so on to the actual research. So we're going to be talking about close-up eye asymmetry. So this is a metaphorical device that communicates both the concepts of alien and human. And I'm going to show that it is a lexical item in comic book visual language. And then I'm going to provide evidence that will hopefully convince you that it became a lexical item because of the cover image for Aladdin Sane. So I am no way trying to argue that this was the first time somebody did close-up eye asymmetry. But what I'm going to argue is that this was the moment when it became incorporated and then spread through that comic book visual language. So close-up eye asymmetry, it's kind of there in the name. First off, you have a close personal distance. And according to visual grammar, this says that the person being depicted is like you. It's like the viewer. So this communicates that Bowie, in this case, is human rather than alien. So he's like us, like the viewer. However, the asymmetry communicates the exact opposite. It communicates that he's not like the viewer, that he's alien, because most things have bilateral symmetry. So together, this one combination, this one metaphor, can communicate both the human and the alien, both the message that this person is like us, and yet somehow unlike us. So that's the metaphorical device of QA. And then close-up eye asymmetry is a lexical item in comic book visual language. So here we have a comic book character Peter Stanchek. He has vast psionic powers, so much so you can see it leaking out of his eyes. And yet on this cover, the artist decided to communicate like us but not like us. So close-up and asymmetry around the eye. There's no reason the other eye shouldn't be lit up except to communicate that idea. And this is found in comic books over and over again. So here we have Magneto, same device. Storm, same device. You can do it with powers. You can do it with light and shading. You can do it with the composition and placement of images. And it's done in mainstream comics, independent comics. You could do it with montage. So once again, this soldier here could have been placed anywhere, but deliberately over the eye to create that asymmetry. This is actually a rare case of the double eye asymmetry because you also have scars just on one side. But again, montage can be used to create this close-up eye asymmetry. And comic book artists were well aware of this. So this is an image of Cable. He was in the new Deadpool 2 movie, originally created by a very influential artist, Rob Liefeld. Influential but not necessarily liked by everyone, because this other influential artist, Alex Ross, was quoted as saying, "The design of Cable, I hated it. The scars, the thing going on with his eye, the arm, and what's with all the guns." So they were aware of this eye asymmetry, this device that could communicate. Whether they were aware that it communicated human and alien, we don't know, but they were aware of its use. So it's a lexical item in comic book visual language. And now the last thing that I'm going to go through is that it became this lexical item. It spread through comic book visual language due to that specific cover of Aladdin Sane. So to do this, I'm going to present 2 lines of evidence, but first we need to establish a few things. Specifically, one thing that will make this more likely. So I'm going to provide evidence. I'm hoping to heap convincing evidence on top of convincing evidence. And the first thing we want to take a look at is, was David Bowie familiar with comic book visual language? You are much more likely to make a contribution to a language if you understand how that language actually works. So for this, we have to keep in mind that Aladdin Sane was released April 1973. So that's when this image was released onto the public. And we know, thankfully, from the exhibit David Bowie is, what David Bowie's top 100 books, his favorite books were. So he was an avid reader, and among those books that came out before the cover for Aladdin Sane, before he created this image, among his top 100 was included the Beano, a comic book from the 60s, Octobriana and the Russian Underground, independent comic book, and also the magazine Private Eye, which wasn't a comic book, but had covers that utilized that comic book language, like sequential images and word bubbles. So David Bowie was familiar with comic book language. The next thing we're going to ask is, are comic book artists influenced by music album art? Right? This is low-hanging fruit. But again, were they even looking in that direction for inspiration? And it's very, once again, we can just use an existence proof. So any guesses?
The Beatles.
The Beatles. So this is Abbey Road. This is Paul McCartney and the Wings, Band on the Run. And hopefully everybody will recognize Aladdin Sane. So comic book artists were looking for inspiration in music art. And that, again, we totally expected. So now the last and most challenging aspect of this was the use of QA due to the cover of Aladdin Sane. So we're going to go through 2 lines of converging evidence. Line number 1 is going to be a logical progression. It's going to start with the release date of Aladdin Sane, follow it up to whether or not David Bowie was influencing popular culture at the time, follow that up with the stage of artistic development, follow that up with the ages at which artists are typically reaching their peak creativity, and this will be the culmination of that first line. So once again, Aladdin Sane, released April 1973. Was David Bowie influencing American culture at that time? Well, this was his 6th studio album. 3 of those were in the Billboard Top 40 during their releases. A documentary and concert film on him was just broadcast on ABC, a 1973 documentary. So if we can all remember back when there were 3 channels, this was a major way to get it out to popular media. So definitely he was having an influence. People knew who David Bowie was. What about artistic development? Well, around the ages of 9 to 13 years old, when children are starting to draw and they're becoming artists, this is a period where developing artists are most open to outside influences. This is where they start to look elsewhere and say, how can I make my art better? And oftentimes around this age, they'll have what's known as a crystallizing experience. They see something, they experience something, and they're like, yes, like this is what I is going to do with my artistic direction. This is what I want to look like. So we have that crystallizing experience, 9 to 13 years of age. And then finally, we have the finding that artists typically reach their peak creative output at approximately 29 years of age. Right? So around that 20 to 30s years where they're usually their most prolific, usually they're most productive. Put that all together, and we have the idea that a child that was between the ages of 9 and 13, when Aladdin Sane was released, would reach their peak creative output 15 to 19 years later when they were approximately 29 years old. 15 to 19 years later is the 90s. So we should see very influential artists in the 90s using this Close-Up Eye Asymmetry. And when we take a look at the top artists of the 90s, we got Rob Liefeld, 6 years when the album came out, 20 to 30 when the 90s hit. We got Adam Hughes, 20 to 30 when the 90s hit. We got Jim Lee, who is an absolute giant, 25 to 35 when the 90s hit. So again, in the right development stage when Aladdin Sane was released, hit their peak creative output in the 90s, and these are all very kind of stereotypical images that you would see in 90s comic books. We got Todd McFarlane with Spawn Comics. We got Mark Silvestri. We got Frank Miller. Again, all near that critical developmental period where an experience like this could be a crystallizing experience, and all the right age in the 90s for that creative peak output. All right, so line number 2 brings back the idea of the graphic schemas that Charles mentioned before. So a graphic schema, you can think of it as a sort of established way that you're going to draw things in comic book. It's almost like a saying in our verbal language. So it's kind of like an accepted, established way that things will be drawn in comics. And the second line of evidence uses the idea that if the cover for Aladdin Sane was responsible for this spread of QA into comic book visual language, then any character that was well established with graphic schemas before the release should be resistant to accepting any change in their graphic schemas. But characters released after, or drawn after the release, they have new graphic schemas that could be easily influenced and incorporate this close-up eye asymmetry. So once again, Aladdin Sane, released April 1973. Super easy to find, extremely well-known characters that were established before that time. And you can just go to Superman in 1938, Batman, first appearance 1939, Wonder Woman, known as the Trinity for DC. So those are the ones that would have had well-established ways of being drawn, graphic schemas, when Aladdin Sane was released. On the other hand, popular characters that were released after that date include Golgo 13, and this is the 5th highest selling manga in the world, so it was really nice to find an international example. And then here in America, we have The Punisher, massively popular, and Wolverine, hugely popular, all coming out after Aladdin Sane was released. So we took a look at their cumulative distributions on publication date here. Right there is where Aladdin Sane came out. And when you take a look at the cumulative distributions for the characters that came out before Aladdin Sane and see how often they were using this close-up eye asymmetry, that's the cumulative distribution right there. So if there was resistance in adopting close-up eye asymmetry here, we should see a much higher line for the ones that came out after Aladdin Sane. And sure enough, there it is, and it is whoppingly significant. So once again, we see that these graphic schemas were much more accepting and much more influenced by close-up asymmetry. And also, interestingly, check out where that inflection point is. It's when those artists who were 9 to 13 reached the ages of 20 to 30. That's when it all of a sudden took off. All right, so that's the second line. So again, 2 converging lines of evidence that indicate that this close-up eye asymmetry that communicates both alien and human, both like us and not like us, may not have been invented by David Bowie, but can be traced back, its incorporation into the language can be traced back to this single image on the cover of Aladdin Sane. All right, so this for art research gives you hopefully new insight into the development of our visual languages. So, and this analysis, looking for those critical periods, doing the cumulative frequency analysis, can again apply to any art style, any media. And then for all the artists out there, it's interesting to see that if you do invent a new metaphor, if you are in your studio and you go, this is amazing, I love this new metaphor, nobody's ever done it, it will be adopted much more quickly by the audience if you also invent new graphic schemas to go along with it. So don't paint the old in your new metaphorical style, paint the new in the new metaphorical style, and that's much more likely to spread. All right, I was worried, but not anymore. We got 8 minutes for questions. So questions for the panel, and I'd like to